Chapter 7, July 3rd, 1863. Abraham heard a mockingbird, its song like liquid silver falling on the air. Then he opened his eyes and knew that he'd been dreaming. There were no bird calls in that place. It was just before dawn, and he was lying on the ground next to his wagon at the edge of the Union Field Hospital. Stiffly, his old joints creaking, he pulled himself up by the wagon wheel. There was a faint smell of decay over the field. In the largest tent, surgeons were operating by candlelight. They'd been working throughout the night, and the stack of amputated limbs outside the tent had grown larger, some of the legs with the shoes and stockings still on them. Everywhere he looked, there were men lying on the ground, some dead, some near death. Lamar was there somewhere, but Lord only knew where. Abraham groaned. "Surely this has to end soon," he thought, leading Charity down to the creek for water. But by all accounts, today would be another battle, and he would go back to gather up what wounded still lived on the battlefield. In early morning, Mrs. Lightly stood up and shook out the folds of her dress. The cellar was shadowy and cool. "Do you hear anything?" she asked. Ladysmith, still sleepy, listened intently for the sound of guns. "I don't. Do you think it's over?" "I sincerely hope so," replied her mother, "and even if it isn't, we need to go back upstairs for food and water." "And fresh air," said Ladysmith, who was beginning to feel like a mole. They had started up the steps when a creaking sound stopped them in their tracks. Someone was walking around upstairs. There was the heavy tread of boots, moving from the front of the house to the back. Easing back down the steps, Ladysmith and her mother hid in the shadows in the farthest corner of the cellar. The red blossoms of poppies stippled the golden fields of wheat. Long silences were broken only by the whisper of wind. The Confederates looked across the peach orchard, a patch of woods, and those gleaming empty fields, and up toward Cemetery Ridge. There, Union troops waited. Then came the words that would change the face of the war. Longstreet, who believed Lee's plan for the day's battle could only end in disaster for his men, nevertheless gave the orders. "Let the batteries open!" The hot afternoon stillness was shattered when at 1:07 p.m. cannons began going off, one by one growing to a long continuous firing of what was the heaviest cannonade ever heard on American soil. Approximately 11,000 soldiers made up the Confederate assault force that day. Major General George Pickett prepared to lead his 3 brigades, 4,900 men across those wheat fields and a mile of open terrain up towards Cemetery Ridge. On the Union side, General Winfield Scott Hancock waited with his 3 divisions, roughly 13,000 men. When Pickett's charge, as the battle was called, ended, an hour and a half later, 7,500 men had been killed, wounded, or captured. The total casualties for the Union infantry was 1,500, just a fraction of the number they inflicted while maintaining their position. As it became apparent to Union troops, even before the final guns were halted, that the battle was theirs, a wild celebration broke out on the heights. Down below, the Confederates straggled slowly back across a bloody plain. General Lee rode out to meet them. "It is all my fault," he told the men. "It is all my fault." Those who could took off their hats to him. Then they drifted on, dragging their muskets behind them, melding like shades into the deep hollows and folds of the hills. Later, the true total of Lee's losses in Pennsylvania would be nearly 28,000 men. All told, over 3 bloody days, more than 50,000 men, both blue and gray, had been killed, wounded, or captured. At sunset, when the guns finally grew quiet, Ladysmith and her mother crawled out from under the table and made their way up the stairs, not knowing what awaited them. Shakily, they stepped up onto a house that they barely recognized. Pale and wan from their hours underground, they blinked at the light of the setting sun that shone through the open front door. The smell of gunpowder was acrid and sharp. They walked through shadowy rooms where window panes were cracked and broken. There were bullet holes in some of the walls, and the floors were caked with dry mud. Living room curtains hung awry over windows open to the outside. Evidence that someone had foraged in the house was plain. "Deserters," whispered Ladysmith's mother. "That's who we heard. Only deserters could have had the time to plunder. They're despicable." Cautiously, she tiptoed into the hall, keeping Ladysmith behind her. But the house was quiet, not with a waiting stillness, but a finished one. In the kitchen, the pantry had been plundered and the pie safe emptied. Bits of broken crockery spilled across the table and onto the floor. The back door, too, was wide open. Lady Smith stood with her back against the wall. She'd been so scared that even the hairs on her arms hurt. She felt dirty and gritty. "Let's look upstairs," whispered her mother. Though afraid, Lady Smith followed her mother up the steps. They peeked into Mrs. Lightly's room. Her writing desk and chest had been looted, the drawers thrown about by someone possibly looking for silver or jewelry. Lady Smith went slowly into her own room. Except for a few bullet holes, it looked the same as when she had left it. She remembered how things used to be before the battle, when she could read by the lamplight. Sometimes she and her mother would have hot cocoa in the kitchen, and maybe Enoch would come for a visit and a small treat. Now, everything had changed. Suddenly, there was a slight movement from beneath her bed. She screamed and jumped back. Enoch crept out, the pupils of his eyes black as coals. Shakily, she picked him up. Unbeknownst to her, he'd followed her to her room as quietly as a shadow, as anxious as she to escape imprisonment in the cellar. They discovered that the barn was not badly damaged, and while the animals had evidently been frightened by the noise and smoke, only one cow was missing. Abraham's house had also been plundered, and a tree in his front garden had been shattered by gunfire. There were numerous bullet holes in his walls, too. The moon was rising when they went out to the front porch. The air was hot and damp and felt like rain, and an unearthly stillness engulfed them. Smoke hung in the branches of the trees in a pearly mist. Not a bird called. They had no idea if the Union or Confederacy had won that day's battle, if it was over for good or just for the day. But Lamar knew. He was now a prisoner of war and had been over to the Lutheran church in town. Along with him were 50 other wounded rebels who'd been captured when the area around the Confederate field hospital had been overtaken by Union troops. All of the churches and every other large building in Gettysburg were now occupied by Union forces and pressed into use as hospitals. He was only semi-conscious when he was taken inside the church, where soldiers lay on long pews and in every aisle. The next day, Independence Day, rain began falling on Gettysburg. At first just a drizzle, then the heavens seemed to open up and pound the land. Water fell in torrents, filling trenches and flooding streams where men lay on the banks, helpless and dying. It washed the blood from the grass and the stones and the faces of the dead. When it became evident that General Meade was not going to attack, the Confederates made plans to leave Gettysburg. All hope that Robert E. Lee had of invading the North had ended. At noon, the wounded began being loaded onto ambulances. Most of the rickety wagons had no springs and very little straw to cushion the ride. Then the ambulance wagon train began hauling the injured and dying over rutted roads for the long journey southward. The train was 17 miles long. In Gettysburg alone, nearly 10,000 men were on their way to northern or southern prisons, and 7,000 bodies needed to be buried. There were 34,000 wounded men in the area. Lamar was lucky. He was faring as well as could be expected. At least, he was out of the rain.